Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. Well, Anita Isalska, it's a pleasure to have you on All Across America.
Pleasure to be here.
Anita, you're the editor of Offbeat North America. It's a collection of 75 travel destinations in the United States. It's got 40 something contributors. How does something like that come together?
It comes together with a lot of love and a lot of sweat. This book it's the kind of pinnacle of what Lonely Planet is all about. That Lonely Planet's mission to bring travelers to beautiful places, but also unexpected places, places that will get you to the heart of local communities and beyond the tourist trail. So the challenge with this book was to uncover as many of these travel secrets from different expert writers as we possibly could, because we all know that Monterey, California is a beautiful place to visit, but what else is there once you depart from that beaten track? And what I love about this project it was an amazing way to connect with so many writers who like find cool places and never quite manage to land that pitch for somewhere that's offbeat. You know, they never quite find a home for that story that might be a ghost town somewhere or some kind of
Ah,
off-beaten trail on an island, and they think to themselves, this is I can finally shoot my shot with offbeat North America. I can get it in there and like show travelers what a cool place this small or under unsung, shall we say, destination is.
right, right. So, I mean, is an all points bulletin put out to previous Lonely Planet writers saying, "Hey, this is the project we're working on. Give us submissions." Is there a big meeting around a round table where folks are kind of jockeying back and forth for the inclusion of their destinations?
Yeah, a combination of all of the above. We had to cast the net pretty wide. So initially,
Yeah.
I was putting out a call for pitches to all of the usual suspects, our very beloved and wide-reaching network of Lonely Planet writers. But there were certain states where I would have loved to get a contribution, but no one was pitching. So that's the point where I had to go into detective mode and say, all right, I need a writer in Alabama or in Nevada, and no one's pitched me those
Okay.
things, so let's have it. So that's the point where I started to look up local bloggers, local contributors, and see
Oh,
if I can
wow.
find someone to bite for places that are a bit underloved. Like East Iowa, for example, was a little harder to find that dream contributor, but it's so worth it, right? Because people don't think I'm going on a road trip, let's hit East Iowa. But
Right.
now it's in the book, and maybe more people will say, you know what, I'm going to add that to my road trip. You never know.
And I mean, speaking of states, you had mentioned Alabama, New Mexico is in there. And that was what was interesting to me because I opened up this book, and of course, it's offbeat North America. So it includes Canada, it includes Mexico as well. But for the purposes of our conversation and just to narrow things down, because there are so many destinations that have kind of settled on the US, makes sense. The podcast is called All Across America. But I expected cities, regions, but in two instances, you did the entire state of New Mexico, the entire state of Alabama. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so in New Mexico's case, there's already a strong tourist trail to some of the places in New Mexico, but like there are so many off-beaten track and angles to like exploring this state that we thought we don't want to be too narrow geographically. We want to get everything in that is those faded boom towns, the Martian landscapes, the crazy ghost stories. So beyond those
Right,
national parks that people might be familiar with, you already know that there's Chile, there's indigenous history, there are road trips, but maybe you don't know
right,
about the dark sky spaces. Maybe you don't know about the
right.
less visited landscapes and the Chaco Canyon National Park and the Badlands and so forth.
Right. Yeah. I mean, of course, New Mexico is famous for Roswell and UFO sightings. And of course, the McDonald's is probably one of the more unique McDonald's in the world, which is a flying saucer shaped McDonald's in downtown Roswell, which is very cool. Never thought I'd say that for a McDonald's franchise, but it's
Super on brand for New Mexico for sure.
But I've also spent some time in the northern part of the state in the canyons area, and of course, it's got the desert. And as you get closer to the southern border, but I love New Mexico. Have you ever heard of a book called The Guide to Free Campgrounds?
I don't know that one. That sounds like I should add it to my list.
It's very, very cool. And I think it's still in existence in a different form in that it's free campgrounds and $20 and other, which is, it's fairly inexpensive considering the price of a hotel room. So I stayed at a lot of these places across the country traveling, and I my favorite one was this unnamed canyon in New Mexico, and you drive in 10 miles off of the nearest paved road, switchbacking down into the canyon, and it was basically a one-lane road. And I was the only person in this entire canyon, which must have been, I don't know, 10 miles long and a mile or two wide, and that was it. And you talk about the night sky, it was just me. And I remember checking my car doors, making sure I didn't leave any lights on because if I got stranded, I wasn't going anywhere for days. So it is a beautiful state with very expansive land. Um,
I love
speaking of,
that. That feeling of awe and kind of fear as well when you realize just how deep you
yes,
are in the middle of whether it's the forest or the desert, and you're just reminded of,
right.
how small and fragile we all are. And that's
Yeah,
always an
yes.
important feeling to have as a traveler. And when you think about traveling sustainably as well, when you really in the midst of that landscape, it gives you a certain respect and a desire to protect it and be kind
It
to it and
really
leave it
does.
as good as you found it.
It really does. And I think folks that have spent a lot of time outdoors, particularly in the mountains, you understand the scale of who we are as human beings compared to, giant mountains in geography. And I mean, I also think it's touching upon the bit of the fear factor of travel, which you never feel more alive than when you're scared, I guess one could say. And it's kind of hard to find that within the comfortable confines of, a first world superpower like the United States. But I think you can, and maybe that's a little bit of what you were going for as an editor is to at least take people a little bit out of their comfort zone.
Yeah, exactly. And that can look like different things for different people. To one person, you got to go way off the beaten track, well beyond cell service and, be running the wilds to feel that kind of rush. But for someone else, it might just be make the journey to that next state over or go to this town, travel solo. And particularly, for women travelers, a great example of a group of
Yeah.
people who are super adventurous, but maybe have to be a little more cautious or have other concerns as they travel. So a book like this is designed to inspire people to like have adventures and think about where you could have them. It's not necessarily travel isn't about everyone descending on the same places in Hawaii or in California. You can have these pretty epic and mind-altering vacations in everywhere from Idaho and Oregon to some even less expected places.
Yeah, and speaking of California, I noticed that there was nothing for California except for the Channel Islands. So the only piece of California was not exactly not the mainland itself, but an island. And I guess that was
Exactly.
deliberate.
Yeah, with California, yeah, I spent 8 years living in California and I've traveled the length and breadth. And I'm currently in California right now, writing the
Right,
next coastal Central Coast chapter for Lonely Planet's California Guide. So I love it to death, but the whole world loves it to death. So
right.
while there's still a lot to be written about California, it's ever changing for a book like Offbeat North America, we wanted to make sure that we're giving a glimpse that is like literally off the beaten track in this case. It's geographically removed from the rest, and Channel Islands is just extraordinarily beautiful and requires quite nausea-inducing ferry ride to get there. So that felt like
Right,
it fit the bill.
right, right. And so, were you a contributor to any of the specific chapters in Offbeat?
In this one, I was purely at the editing helm instead of writing because, yeah, while my own writing for LP focuses on a lot of California and Pacific Northwest, I wanted to keep my hands out of this one and let our contributor pool do their magic.
Nice. And so we were talking a little bit about where you are now. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm on the road at the moment researching for Lonely Planet's next California guide, and my beat is essentially Santa Cruz down to San Luis Obispo. And right now I'm in
Wow.
Salinas, which is potentially something else that fits that bill of offbeat
Right.
because it's not the natural place that a traveler, especially from outside of the US or from far away within the US, would gravitate towards. This is a pretty industrial workaday kind of city. There's a
Right.
lot going on in terms of agriculture and industry, but when you think about the top tier sites of Salinas, they're pretty few, and that's always the most
Right.
fun to research as a travel writer.
Right. And particularly because I think things have been done to the death in certain respects, and particularly, the big cities in California, particularly the big cities in Europe, but not so much Salinas.
Not so
It's
much
the art.
Salinas, but yeah, that's the joy of it
The,
for me is saying, all right, what
exactly.
what is a good reason to go? Maybe it's the food scene, which by the way is fantastic. Very much enjoying that so far, but also looking for new angles and ways that people might want to springboard from Salinas into the national parks, for example.
Right.
Yesterday was my first visit to Fort Ord National Monument, which has like fantastic cycling and walking
Okay.
trails. To my shame, hadn't even heard of it before this trip. So, like, just the sheer riches of wild spaces that exist here, it's phenomenal and well worth exploring for people who want to get a taste of California life as it is lived outside of the glitzier places. And
Right.
it's always
Right.
interesting to see how you're received as a traveler as well.
And what was the name of that national monument again?
Fort Ord National Monument. It has kind of
Okay.
an interesting history because I believe, originally it was some kind of military base. I don't want to get this wrong, so I'll have to fact check this. Um, and now it's conserved lands where you can go hiking, you can go cycling. It's very kind of rugged terrain that is very wild and feels off beaten track, even though some of the trailheads are pretty close to the highway.
Right. And well, don't feel ashamed for having not heard of it before. I can't say that I have either. And I'm sure many of our listeners haven't either. And again, I guess that's what it's all about. I mean, one thing I do know about Salinas in that area is it's the artichoke capital of the world. Am I in the right location?
You are, and so much so that a couple of days ago I stopped via Castroville, which has a giant
Yes.
artichoke statue outside one of its stores. So obviously I had to stop and look at that. I'm a big fan of quirky roadside stuff. And,
Right.
if that kind of granular product that people are so proud of, I get a real kick out of it because not everywhere is so proud of their local produce, right? So I'm going to stop at that
Right.
artichoke. I'm going to take a see at it, and yeah, I think it can be one of the more magical kinds of experience as a traveler because you a lot of people have a photograph if they are lucky enough to get to New York, they'll have that Statue of Liberty picture. How many people have the
Sure.
Castroville artichoke?
I don't know that there's a similar. I feel like I love artichokes. My kids really love artichokes. I've been into Castroville and have bought even artichoke dishes to bring home to my wife when I was visiting out there. And I feel like the southern equivalent would be okra.
Mm. So a giant okra statue.
Yeah, I don't know if Mississippi has a giant okra statue, but the name of and this brings it this is something that Central California has in common is really good college sports team names. And so Santa Cruz, University of Santa Cruz is famous for the banana slugs. And
Ah, yes.
Delta State in Mississippi Delta, outside of about 10 miles south of Clarksdale, has the Fighting Okra.
Oh, I love that. That's almost poetic. I thought we probably couldn't top the banana slugs, but there we have it. No, only a
I
few days ago I was down at Santa Cruz's mystery spot and like the sheer
ah.
volume of banana slug merch, t-shirts, takeaway toys, it was really mind-blowing. And for foreign travelers who've never seen a banana slug in the wild, I can only imagine how bewildering it is as an industry, the banana slug souvenir market.
Well, University of Santa Cruz is known for a lot of things. Their sports prowess isn't. So I think they've got more notoriety for their mascot than the players themselves. But correct me if I'm wrong, if they're, winning any national championships. Forgive me, University of Santa Cruz student athletes. You are the best. Although they should have an exhibition match versus the Fighting Okra. I think that would be fantastic for
Just pit
ESPN3.
teams against each other based on, based on the quirkiness of the mascot. I love that.
Um, well, Central California is really one of my favorite places in the country, and but again, that's been very well documented. Less so Salinas, but maybe we could talk about some of the destinations I've been to that are in the book that I love, and feel free to chime in, and if you heard more from the author of that section, I'm just going to run through them, and I just think they're just such great selections. Some of them surprising. The first of which is Butte, Montana,
Yeah.
which is
Surprising good or surprising bad?
surprising in a very good way because Butte is one of those towns in every state where people like to rag on it in particular. And Butte is that for Montana, as Rutland tends to be for Vermont, Gary, Indiana, in California, Bakersfield, Stockton up north. But I think Butte's a great town. And I love that it's included in Offbeat North America.
Oh, I love to hear that because part of the goal is to help instill that kind of pride in places that locals know are phenomenal, but that visitors might not necessarily have an angle or an excuse to go visit. And in the case of Butte, Montana, the author of this spread, Kristen Pope, super fan of this kind of big sky country and really keen to lead people towards the kind of experiences that they may look for at better known national parks or better known
Yeah.
wilderness spaces, but give you somewhere that has a little bit of quirky mining history and has some kind of
Yes.
unexpected sights, but all of the outdoorsy reasons that you would have to visit somewhere, like going outside, doing cross-country skiing, all of the things.
And a couple places that I'm actually going to be visiting two of them, which are probably more of the offbeat because they tend to be right in the middle of the country where a lot of people tend to rush through either by plane or driving through on Route 80. So I'll be in Grand Isle, Nebraska in June. I'll be actually recording a podcast on location from Grand Isle, Nebraska. So I'm super excited about that. I reached out to Growing Small Town Nebraska podcast. And the host, first name is Sheila. Her last name is escaping me, but I'm excited to meet with her. And then I'll be driving north through Nebraska, northwest into South Dakota, then up to North Dakota to Teddy Roosevelt National Park. So I'm very
That is a
excited for that.
nice road trip. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I'm going to be excited to follow up on whether you love the recommendations in the book because Grand Island has all of the ingredients for an offbeat trip, right? Because it's got this fascinating history where there's a mix of French fur traders and indigenous history and the original collision of German migrants and French migrants and people from all over converging on this place and growing it into what it is today. And now the fact that it has kind of a craft beer scene and it's got quirky golf courses and things to do here and there, water parks, it's kind of gone from somewhere that was really out there, in the midst of the Great Plains to something that is just a super fun hub for travelers to visit if they are willing to make the time to, peel back the layers of a place that might not be completely expected and out there for a traveler.
Yes, it will be a lot of driving. It's 3 hours from Omaha, and then I'll be going through the sand hills of Nebraska. So there'll be a lot of hours of driving in a direction that most folks don't tend to go, which is north through the Great Plains. I think a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people are going east or west passing through. So I'm excited to be on desolate highways where, you pass one car every 30 minutes and you have to do the obligatory wave. You just lift two fingers off the steering wheel to
Absolutely, because it's a way of seeing someone else's humanity, but also at the same time, we make ourselves kind of vulnerable as travelers. We put ourselves out there and we're putting a lot of trust in our common, our fellow man and the kindness of strangers. And I love these gestures that we make when we encounter other travelers, whether that's driving or whether it's on a hiking trail. We acknowledge each other. It's like a simple way of saying, "Hey, I see you. We're both on these epic journeys. I'm here." And
Right.
I there's a kind of camaraderie in that I really appreciate.
Definitely, definitely. It's almost like backpackers in Europe who've got the big backpack in their back, and then they've got the front backpack as well. It's like you can see them coming from miles away, and they're just of a subset. And it's always exciting to encounter both locals, but then I think also travelers as well.
Yeah, 100%, because it makes always makes me curious what type of quest other travelers are on. Are they here for work? Are they here to get space away from friends and family? Are they meeting up with friends and family? What kind of journey are they on? Everything's a kind of pilgrimage, right? Whether it's like seeking some kind of understanding of a place, or whether it's to meet up with people we already know,
Yeah.
or whether it's just to be surprised or stirred by the landscape or the city that we see. So I adore people's travel stories, and obviously, it's a little bit of a cliche that backpackers boring each other in a pub with all of the places they've been to, but I can't get
Right.
enough of it. It's like I will never be bored if a stranger at a bar tells me where they're coming from and where they're going.
Yeah, yeah. It's I always love playing the game of particularly traveling or you see people that are together and particularly in travel destinations or clear that are traveling, but sometimes, trying to find out, okay, what is this group? What brought them together? You've got five
Mm.
people, and I remember traveling in Italy in the Isle of Sardinia, and our age range of our group of half dozen of us was almost 50 years. And I remember the Italians and it was Americans and folks from the UK and Ireland. And I remember Italians looking at us and with that expression of like perplexity, trying to figure out how this group came together. And it was just, we were all staying at the same youth hostel.
So just all converged in the right moment in time
Pretty
and nothing
much.
connecting you other than that moment and that place. There's something really beautiful about that.
Yeah. Can you talk about and I'm sure you've traveled. I mean, of course you were in France a few weeks ago. We were trading stories by email. The youth hostel culture is burgeoning in the United States, and I've worked at a youth hostel in Cape Cod during my college days, but it's not quite as strong as it is in Europe and other travel destinations abroad. Why do you think that is?
I wonder whether it's something to do with the way people occupy third spaces in cities. Because something that struck me as a European, I grew up in the UK and I've lived in France for a period, and over the past 8 years, I've been living in the US. Is that I think Europeans do a great job of occupying third spaces, like milling around the town square, sitting in parks,
Yes.
but maybe something to do with the kind of transportation that's preferred in the US. It tends to be a car, which is your little
Yeah.
bubble where you get from place to place. So in Europe, the idea that you would have a common space in a hostel, milling around with random travelers or sharing the same kind of dorm room, it feels like a natural thing that you might do because you've also just shared a train carriage with them or you've been on the same bus. So we're
Right.
used to occupying space with other human beings. But in the US, I think there's more of a sense of personal space, and that comes from perhaps that's transportation, perhaps that's just there's a ton of land here. So we tend to have
Yeah.
larger houses or apartments in the US compared to Europe.
Yes.
So the idea of a hostel might be a little more foreign or a bit more confronting because it really puts you right in the physical space of other travelers. And that can be daunting, especially if it's your first time.
For sure. And I think it's really all the above, the amount of sitting in our driving in our bubble and where there just is a lot of space in the United States. So I think it's a little bit of both. You did mention cars. And for travelers who are considering and when I lived in Europe, folks would say, "Oh, I'm headed to the United States. how do you get around? And I would always say to people, do not take the bus.
Yeah, that was a culture shock for me coming to the US for sure, because I'm very used to bolting around on trains and buses, and that's just a natural and economically and environmentally smart thing to do. I don't want to be
Right.
searching for a parking space in the middle of a tiny Spanish plaza. I want to just get off the train, stroll straight out and start eating my tapas. It's very frictionless. But
Yeah.
in the US, suddenly there's this pressure to be able to have your own car because if you can't maintain that, that almost seems like there's a status associated with that, or there's a lack of freedom that's associated with that. Cars really represent freedom and they represent travel here. And I had to adjust to that culture because one of the parts of travel that I love is having the random conversation on the train or
That's true. Yeah.
experiencing the people watching at a train station or I'm walking a lot. And there are a lot of cities where they're just quite walking unfriendly or there's barely a sidewalk. So you'll look on your
Yeah.
Google Maps or your mapping tool and you'll expect to be able to make that 15-minute walk, but people will look at you like you're crazy.
Well, buses can represent freedom to some people, and they often stop in outside of prisons. And so people who are being let out of prison for the first time in years, one of the first things they'll see is the Greyhound bus. You may not want to be sharing your seat with a recently paroled convict, but there are definitely some interesting people traveling by bus in the United States, and so I do recommend a car. Although I love the train. It is an epic cross-continental journey by train. But on the coast, particularly in the Northeast, traveling from Boston to DC, Virginia, and beyond, Amtrak is wonderful. And one of my favorite ways to travel in the world is the cafe car on Amtrak.
Ah, love that. Over on the West Coast, there's of course the Pacific Surfliner. So if you want to make
Yes.
that pretty slow journey all the way from San
Yes.
Diego way up north, then you have the option to do that. And you can't complain about the speed when you have views of the Pacific Ocean most of the way there. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's something about slow travel that uh, just puts you in a different mental space, I think, compared to thinking about the traffic or having to adjust to other cars. It's just a very different mode of travel. It's almost becomes mindfulness.
It really is. And in fact, Amtrak had a writer in residence program some years ago. I'm not sure if they're still doing it, but Amtrak, the trains in Europe are known for their punctuality, not so much in the United States. There's the Acela, which goes from Boston to DC, and that is a lot of business people. So that one is the only one that's on time, but a lot of the routes are known for just being 2 hours behind schedule as per, standard operating procedure. So it's going slow, and I think it's just one of those things. And with travel is if our expectations are too high, then we're going to be disappointed. But if you do take a bus or a train and you know that it's not going to be the fastest mode of getting from point A to point B, you're going to enjoy the experience so much more.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's comes down to what you're hoping for from your pilgrimage or your journey. Is it to have interesting conversations with strangers in these liminal spaces while you're waiting for that train or while you're queuing up to get your coffee before boarding your bus? Or is it all about the experience when you get there? And obviously, as a travel writer, I'm firmly in the first camp. I want to have those like chance encounters with random people. I want to eavesdrop on some fascinating conversation that I won't listen to if I've got earbuds on or if I'm in my car. Those are the kinds of things you end up telling your beloved when you get home or relating to friends. Those are always the most fun anecdotes, even more so than when you finally see the Grand Canyon or whichever epic
Right.
site you're going to see.
Right, right, very true. Well, turning back to a couple of the spots in the book, I'm looking at a couple. One that I mentioned briefly, which was Clarksdale, Mississippi, which is in the Mississippi Delta, south of Memphis. And Clarksdale has per capita, there is probably no place in the world that has as many blues clubs as the tiny town of Clarksdale, which may have, I don't know, 20 or 25,000 people. Every year they have across the Mississippi River the King Biscuit Blues Festival in Helena, Arkansas. And so I went and saw that with a friend and then spent the night in Clarksdale. And I think we went to four blues clubs in one evening. Which was just, it was an amazing, amazing time. And went to Red's Bar, which is one of my favorite spots. And there was a picture of Red's in Offbeat North America. So it was very cool to see that. And speaking of music, Lafayette, Louisiana, not too far away from Clarksdale, which is about an hour and a half west of New Orleans. That's into Cajun and Zydeco country, and they have their international festival every year, which is coming up, I think, in June. So that's a really very cool town in Southwest Louisiana.
Yeah,
Um,
music is one of the best reasons to travel, surely. Going to see live blues or rock, it's right up there with traveling to see food. And I think it was the food angle that's got me super excited when the writer of the Clarksdale feature in the book, Joel Balsam, when he pitched
okay.
this, his description of the kind of soul food and like amazing cuisine that you can get in Clarksdale really just had me kind of fanning myself as I read his pitch for this. Just the tamales and the wingtips and like fried catfish and all of the just really kind of like earthy flavors that you're going to be eating as you listen to incredible blues music. I could just kind of taste and feel the place without even seeing
Yeah.
it. So, yeah, it was a slam dunk to include in the book. Like somewhere that has that all sensory experience, right? Where you can really feel the vibration of a place and really kind of taste these recipes that have been handed down. That is such a beautiful reason to travel.
Yeah, it sure is. And turning to a place not so much known for its food, but really known for, I guess, being offbeat, particularly in an area of the world that is so well known, and that's Staten Island, New York.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Staten Island, so I was pretty bullish about getting this into the book because it's one of those places that kind of grows on you. And I
Yeah.
think your first, second, third visit to New York, you're probably not going to make it to Staten Island beyond
No.
getting on the ferry and immediately doing a U-turn. But I think I'm a big fan of the show What We Do in the Shadows, which is kind of a mockudrama where a bunch of vampires are living together in Staten Island, and it's absurd, it's surreal, it's kind of comical, but in a weird way, it puts Staten Island on the map of like, comedy fans, and I think it's got
Yeah.
more people curious about what is this kind of offbeat, middle of nowhere place that we all know exists because we all get the Staten Island ferry, but we never
Right.
hang around there to discover, what the local scene is like, who hangs out in the bars, what is the food scene, which is surprisingly a little Sri Lanka
Mm,
community.
yes.
So there are
Yes.
so many great reasons to go there, but it is hard, it's a hard one to justify because you're in one of the greatest cities in the world in New
Yeah.
York.
Yes. Well, I mean, that's why I love its inclusion in Offbeat North America because it's offbeat for the most onbeat place ever. You know?
Exactly. Like people get so close and then they just immediately turn back.
That's right.
And who could blame them, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do have to say, for any tourist to visit New York, my number one thing that I recommend is what you had said, is the Staten Island Ferry. It
Yeah.
runs 24/7. It's absolutely free. Great, the best views of the New York City skyline. And yeah, most people take it. I think you have to mandatory leave the boat to wait around for 3 minutes and get right back on the next ferry. And that's what exactly what most people do. So, most tourists will have spent exactly 3 minutes in Staten Island.
Yeah, 100%. But, if you spend a little bit longer, then there are some really beautiful stately homes in Staten Island, which I don't think I expected when I first visited there. There's the
Yeah,
Alice Austen House Museum, and you get to walk around and look at these amazing photographs and hear this tender love story about Austen and her partner. There are beautiful gardens to see. So, in
yeah.
between, eating a ton of fantastic food and going to some pretty out there dive bars, you can get a lot of you can really soak in culture of past centuries in Staten Island, and
Yeah.
that's, a great reason to stick around.
My dad is from Tottenville, and I had family living on Staten Island for many years, so it's definitely very close to me. But in reading the book, I knew very little about the tourist destinations of Staten Island because, of course, I'm visiting my grandmother or great aunt and going to family functions and the last time I was there for a funeral. So it's nice to
Mm.
see even for an area that I know so well that just learning about these cultural areas that are completely foreign to me and maybe foreign to people that live in the areas themselves. Have you found that?
Yeah, 100%. And one of the joys of putting together the content plan for this book was realizing that I actually didn't know the places that I thought I knew as well as I thought. And
Right.
for example, Oregon's a great example of that. It's, within road trip territory for me when I was living in California, and now I'm based in Seattle. So again,
Mm.
within striking distance of all that fantastic skiing terrain and wine country. But being able to include places that were pretty new to me up until a couple of years ago, like the John Day region, which is absolutely spectacular. I've since visited, and it's almost like a painter has just had at it with the mountains and created these gorgeous streaks of like ochre and red, like these banded mountains that are just unbelievably photogenic. And the town of Pendleton nearby as well is kind of a hidden
Ah,
gem. So there's a
yes.
lot of fun places if you just head further east in Oregon and away from that
Right.
tourist trail that we all know and love, the Willamette Valley and Bend and so forth.
Yes, in fact, I had a guest on the show for the Greater Idaho Movement, and this was last December. And Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington State, as you know, are very different from the western half of the states, both in geography and culturally. And so this was a movement to secede from the state of Oregon, the areas basically east of Bend, and become part of Idaho. And there are definitely off the beaten track parts of both of those states that are far less touristy and just very different culturally and politically.
Yeah, that is very interesting because it's the other half of the story of the Cascadia movement, which is proposing that Washington, California, parts of Oregon, and
Yes,
I think they kind of like British Columbia as well, but that's probably a longer
right.
negotiation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's exactly it. Yes. One to kind of create its own, I don't know, utopia, and the other, I guess, also to create its own utopia, but just, I guess, a different sense of utopia.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's people often remark on their first visits to on multi-state visits to the US that it feels more like a collection of different countries than one gigantic country. And I think there's something interesting and beautiful about the fact that people have so much regional pride that they think, you know what, Idaho, it's its own thing. We can, we can see such a significant difference between ourselves and our neighbors that we could be our own independently run thing. All right. But at the same time, obviously, wanting people to feel harmonious with their neighbors, you got to ask some
Yeah.
questions about, the ultimate end game of that. But and we're in pretty divided times already, so it's
Yeah.
natural that people start to brainstorm. But I think it's long been this way. There have been micronations trying to self-declare themselves from the US, I believe in California for quite a while.
Yeah.
So it's definitely not this political moment in time that's bringing that out.
Yeah, there's a book about all of these succession movements, and apparently it's been a thing in the United States for, I mean, since the beginning. So the Greater Idaho or the Cascadia movement is really nothing new, and bound state boundaries, yes, the political boundaries of between countries, that's one thing, but state boundaries, nothing set in stone. So I'm always a fan of how places can evolve both culturally and I guess geographically. And I always say animals don't care when they cross state lines. They don't know the difference. So I guess it really does for humans, particularly out west with the nice square straight line boundaries. I don't know, put a couple squiggles in there.
Well, I'll be waiting to see whether those plans for the state of Jefferson ever gather
Right.
fruition. That one seems to have gone quiet, so it's interesting to see
Yes.
the plans taking bigger shape. The Cascadia movement I'm
Oh,
hearing a lot
yeah.
more about lately than Jefferson, so people are thinking
Oh,
big.
Okay, well, we'll see. I mean, there was once one in New York State, another one in Illinois, kind of divesting itself from the city of Chicago. So, I mean, some of it's wishful thinking, but I think it's a good way to sound the alarm for the people that maybe feel unheard.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to champion what is distinct about your region and your politics. And it's never a bad thing to just make government a little bit nervous and remind them that, the people ultimately are
That's
going to
right.
govern themselves and the people are the ones in charge. So any way of putting your head above the parapet and saying, hey, we're the state of Jefferson and this is what we
We're
believe,
here.
I'm here
We're
for it.
here. Well, I wanted to turn a little bit to, if I may, to some of your other works, and you talked about Lonely Planet for California. I also saw that you were worked on the Lonely Planet Guide to Death, Grief, and Rebirth. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it seems like an odd topic for a travel company like Lonely Planet to write a guide to death, but in some ways it makes perfect sense because a guidebook company is introducing you to places and ways of thinking and cultures and ways of eating, all of
Right.
these things. So why not also have a guide into understanding different ways of processing and grieving death? Because that's, the ultimate journey, right? It's the journey we all take.
Yeah.
And there is so much collective wisdom if we just curate it together and try and process the ways that other people experience death and grief. And this topic has been something of a personal obsession to me. I've always been that
Okay.
traveler who has visited places of mourning, places where suffering has been memorialized, places like cemeteries, places like old wartime sites, because I think they're an important way to maintain our collective memory of generations past. And it's also very much influences how we live. If we respect our dead, then I think that gives us comfort in life. So this book was, although macabre sounding, it was a real dream project for me to pull together many, many years of visiting places of
Wow.
mourning and places of celebrating the dead. Because, of course, when we
Yeah.
remember the dead, it can be jubilant, it can be inebriated, it can be completely off the wall. So it was a
Yeah.
fascinating thing to research and write.
A lot of folks know about the Janus funerals in New Orleans, but I was less familiar with the Lakota Soul Keepers.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of ancient wisdom that I think uh, can teach us as a modern society, like how to reflect on the people we've lost. So your death itself, we think of it as being a very direct transition or an ending even. And so the idea that you can conceptualize death as a walking on or a way station along a journey rather than your final destination is incredibly consoling, regardless of the spiritual beliefs that you subscribe to yourself.
Right.
So, in researching this and speaking to diverse people who grieve in just dramatically different ways, it makes you reflect on whether your own grieving and mourning practices are actually doing you any good. Is there another way
Yeah.
that we could conceptualize death? Is there another way that we can, approach burials or approach leaving flowers on someone's grave? How do we think about this in a way that is going to uplift and console the people left behind, but also inspire us to live better lives?
Yeah, I think it is a strange ritual, most of the funerals held, at least in the United States, where it's, an open casket, the embalming process, the wake, the funeral itself. It can be less a celebration of life and more a almost consumerist um, funeral director influenced finality to it. So it's great to see it approached in a more thoughtful manner in other cultures.
Yeah, 100%, because people are starting to question whether the typical ways of burial, especially in the Western world, in countries like the United States, are these consoling us or are they actually traumatizing us in a different way? Because uh, if we approach a funeral and it's incredibly it's formal. People are wearing black. People feel that it's unseemly to express emotion beyond exchanging pleasantries. People trying
Mm.
to, hold in their feelings. What purpose is a funeral serving other than decorum or uh, appearing seemly and like, well behaved in front of one's relatives? And
Yeah,
increasingly, people are looking for alternatives. And in the US, what is the alternative to that rigid formula of, wooden caskets and concrete-lined graves? A lot of
right.
people are thinking about the environmental cost as well.
Sure.
There's a lot of embalming fluid that's going into this industry. And what
Right.
is that for? Why are we putting that back into the earth? There are historical reasons why embalming is so huge in the US compared to other countries. I think it might date back to the Civil War when bodies needed to be transported across long distances, so
Right.
embalming became a thing. But now, particularly in California, appropriately, such a green-minded place, people are thinking about what does a green burial look like? Can you be buried in
Right.
a biodegradable shroud? Can you be at
Sure.
one with a coral reef? It's kind of fascinating and makes you think about death in a completely different way.
I wouldn't mind being one with a coral reef. I do remember going to, it was a convention. It was like an environmental convention, all these different green products, and they had one booth with I guess, a environmental way to um, bury yourself, and I think it was a shroud that had mushrooms, or it would basically further decompose your body in a quicker manner. And I just remember being struck by the bright and more earth tone colors of many of the people in attendance. And they had these two very serious looking people in jet black clothing selling their green funeral services. So,
Well, I believe that's a California invention in Fernwood Cemetery. You can go over there and put in your request for that mushroom suit and,
right.
get those fungal spores to speed up the process and bring you back to Mother Earth more quickly than you would ordinarily. But we got options. You can be shot off into space. You can be at one with a
Right.
coral reef. There's always that last bid for immortality in a cryogenic chamber, which I'm sure some of
Sure.
the Silicon Valley billionaires are going for.
Right, right. Or we can just take supplements and shots and try to live forever.
I mean,
So-
that's plan A, but if that doesn't work out, then maybe a Viking sea burial or, we'll get
Right,
creative.
right. You know, I always say there's very few certainties in life, but death is surely one of them. So,
Yeah, that's why I like to think of, this death book was a natural partner to thinking about travel, because ultimately it's your final destination. It's the last journey you're ever going to
sure.
take. So
Yeah.
you probably want a heck of a send-off. And
Yeah.
that's when things like New Orleans funerals come into play. And
Oh,
for
yeah.
anyone who's ever found themselves accidentally a part of a procession of umbrella twirling, dancing mourners, it's really quite the way to go out.
Yeah, it sure is. I used to live in New Orleans, and I didn't die there, so never had a second line, but I've surely seen quite a few. So, and it is something special. It's, and it's a two-part, and a lot of folks think that it is all a celebration of the person's life, but it is also, there are dirges, there are songs that are very downhearted and downtrodden, evoking the sadness of the person passing. So it is really a two-stage process of both the celebration of life and grief. But most of these services are just a one stage, and it's just all about the grief and less so about the celebration of the person themselves.
Yeah, and I think travelers have long had an interest in seeing how death customs are enacted in different cultures. And people have
Yeah.
always traveled for Day of the Dead in Mexico, for example.
Right.
But there's an increase in that interest, and more people are wanting to visit sites of tragedy and pay their respects and try and understand what the factors were that led to these tragedies happening. And it's a way to be a student of history, but it's also a way to understand deeply what a present living culture is like. Because when you see how they're memorializing their dead, you understand how they're living as well. So, like, travel and death have always been the best of friends.
I think so. And it also says what's important to people. Who are they honoring?
Yeah, 100%. Because when you see that someone's ancestors are being honored, at the For example, there are villages in Indonesia where mummification is still happens,
Oh,
and you
wow.
might see mummified bodies at the entrance to a village. That's fascinating, and that speaks to a really deep reverence and ever presence of people's ancestors that is, although it may seem macabre to the traditional Western mindset, when you sit and reflect on it, it's very beautiful that a family lineage is still represented and honored even in the years after their passing.
Yeah, it sure is. And so, how do you pitch a book like this, and how did you pitch yourself initially to Lonely Planet? How does one become a Lonely Planet travel writer?
That's a great question. With the death book, it was obviously a little different. I've been begging to write a book about cemeteries and death in travel for years, and then
Oh,
finally the
wow.
moment arrived. But becoming a travel writer for Lonely Planet, it's a rare breed of person who loves to roam widely, who is kind of itchy to explore places and really wants to get under the skin of a destination. Because Lonely Planet authors, they don't take sponsored trips when they're researching guidebooks. Like they are going out there, they're paying for stuff, they're experiencing things. There is no like PR person leading their hand. So
Wow.
with that, you can guarantee that they're having these experiences authentically, and if they're writing about them, they think that they're genuinely great, and you should go do them. So it's for people with just boundless energy and boundless curiosity, I think would be the one uniting factor of an otherwise very diverse writer pool.
And who writes the histories? And what I found, what I love about the Lonely Planet guides is, not only is it about lodging and restaurants and, places the sights to see, but it also has this just a quick history that really it's so hard to find in any other book. And whether it be travel guide or not, it's just so well done and so easy to absorb in a way that you're not going to find in a typical history book, which might be a 500-page doorstop.
Yeah, because it's like every single edition, those history sections are re-edited, rewritten, and they're always written with what does the modern traveler have in mind? What do they need to know about a destination? Because if you're scrolling endlessly through a Wikipedia page, sure, you're going to pick up a few facts, but
Yeah.
what does the experienced travel expert who knows that place like the back of their hand, what do they think the most important takeaways from the ancient and more recent history of a place are? And more importantly, how can you go out and experience those things? So the way that we at Lonely Planet try and present history is always through, and here's the place that you can go and see that, and here's the
Yeah.
monument to that, and this is
Gotcha.
the ground that person first stood on, so you can really tangibly experience that history rather than just reading about it in the book.
Yeah. And so what are you working on now? What's next?
What's next? A whole lot of California, and then after that, I'm going to take a breather and see what happens. I'll be spending some time in France, one of my favorite places in the world, and I suspect a lot of hiking stories are going to come out of that.
Excellent. And how can people find out more about you?
You can follow me on Instagram, easy to Google, name Anita Isalska, and over on my website as well, anitaisalska.com.
Excellent. Well, Anita, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for being on All Across America.
Thank you so much for speaking with me. Love the conversation.